My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 54 years old, and I own a family-run vineyard tucked into the rolling hills outside Sonoma, California, where every season leaves its signature on the land. Spring arrives with endless rows of bright green vines stretching toward the horizon, summer fills the air with the scent of warm earth and ripening grapes, autumn brings the organized chaos of harvest, and winter strips everything bare until only patience remains. My grandparents planted the first vines nearly 70 years ago after arriving in California with little more than a borrowed truck and a stubborn belief that hard work could grow into something lasting. My father spent his life expanding the property 1 acre at a time, and when he passed it on to me, I promised I would protect not only the business but the legacy woven into every bottle that carried our family name. Running a vineyard isn't as romantic as visitors imagine. Before tourists arrive for tastings, there are irrigation systems that fail without warning, tractors that refuse to start before sunrise, barrels that demand constant attention, contracts to negotiate, and weather forecasts that can determine whether an entire year's work succeeds or disappears overnight. Every morning begins before dawn with a mug of black coffee and a slow walk through the vines, listening to the quiet that exists only before the world wakes up. For nearly 29 years, I never walked those rows alone. My wife, Rebecca, had an extraordinary gift for making every corner of the vineyard feel alive. She remembered the names of returning guests, planned every harvest celebration, decorated the tasting room with fresh flowers she picked herself, and somehow convinced strangers they had been friends with us for years. Then, 6 years ago, an aggressive illness stole her away in less than 4 months. One season we were planning a vineyard expansion together, and by the next harvest I was standing beside her grave wondering how the world could continue moving while mine had stopped completely. The day after her funeral, I unlocked the winery at exactly 6 in the morning because I couldn't imagine staying home inside a house where every room echoed with her absence. I left her favorite sun hat hanging beside the office door, kept her handwritten recipes in the kitchen drawer untouched, and refused to replace the faded rocking chair on the porch where we had watched sunsets together for decades. People from town checked on me often at first. They brought homemade pies, offered kind words, and reminded me that time would eventually make things easier. But life has a way of pulling everyone back into their own routines, while grief quietly convinces the person left behind that standing still somehow honors the one they've lost. I believed that lie for years. The only person who never seemed to disappear was Lily Bennett, the 29-year-old owner of a small artisan bakery just across the country road from the vineyard entrance. I'd known Lily since she was a little girl who rode her bicycle past the vines with flour dust somehow already covering her clothes because she spent every afternoon helping her grandmother bake bread. After studying culinary arts in Portland, she returned home instead of chasing big city success and transformed her grandmother's tiny bakery into the busiest cafe in the valley. Every Friday morning she crossed the road carrying 2 paper bags and 2 steaming cups of coffee. She always smiled and claimed the bakery had accidentally made an extra almond croissant that would go stale if nobody ate it. I knew perfectly well there was never an extra pastry, just as she knew I would never embarrass either of us by pointing that out. Those quiet Friday mornings slowly became part of my routine. Sometimes we talked about tourists who confused wine grapes with table grapes, unpredictable California weather, or the families visiting the valley for weddings. Other mornings we simply stood on the wooden overlook above the vineyard, watching the sunrise paint the hills in shades of gold and amber without feeling the need to fill every silence. Around Lily, the loneliness that usually followed me everywhere became strangely lighter, and although I insisted to myself she was simply showing kindness to an aging widower everyone pitied, a part of me began looking forward to Fridays more than I cared to admit. I never allowed myself to question why. The routine continued for nearly 3 years, so naturally that I stopped noticing how much those Friday mornings meant to me until the day they nearly changed everything. It was the first week of October, when harvest season filled the vineyard with tractors, workers, and the sweet scent of crushed grapes drifting through the cool morning air. Lily arrived carrying the usual coffee and pastry, but instead of walking beside me toward the overlook, she remained standing near the old oak tree overlooking the vines. There was something unusually thoughtful in her expression, as though she'd rehearsed a conversation 100 times without deciding how to begin. We watched the workers loading grape bins in comfortable silence before she laughed softly at one of my terrible jokes about tourists believing wine came from factories instead of farms. Her laughter lingered just long enough for me to feel younger than I had in years. Trying to hide the warmth spreading through my chest, I smiled and shook my head. "You know, Lily," I said lightly, "a woman like you shouldn't waste her Fridays bringing breakfast to an old widower. You deserve someone younger. Someone who can give you the kind of future you're supposed to have." I expected her to roll her eyes, tease me for being dramatic, and hand me another napkin the way she always did. Instead, the smile slowly disappeared from her face. She looked directly into my eyes with a calm certainty that stole every excuse from my mind, then quietly reached for my hand. Her fingers were warm despite the chilly morning. "Daniel," she whispered, "you're the only man I want." For a heartbeat, the entire vineyard seemed to fall silent. The rumble of tractors faded into the distance, birds circled overhead unnoticed, and even the breeze moving through the vines felt impossibly still. I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. "Lily," was all I managed to say. She didn't look away. "I've wanted to tell you for a long time," she continued gently. "But every time I thought you might finally be ready to hear it, I'd see that same sadness in your eyes and convince myself I should wait a little longer." My heart pounded harder than it had in decades. "You can't mean that." "Why not?" she asked quietly. "Because I'm 54. "I know. You're 29. She nodded once. "I know that too. People would think you've lost your mind." A faint smile touched her lips. "People have always enjoyed talking." I pulled my hand away, not because I wanted to, but because fear arrived faster than hope. "Lily, you're confusing kindness with love." She slowly shook her head. "No. You're confusing your fear with reality." Before I could answer, one of my vineyard managers called my name from across the property, asking about a delivery truck waiting near the loading dock. The interruption lasted barely a minute, but when I turned back, Lily was already picking up the empty coffee cups. "I should get back to the bakery," she said softly. "The breakfast crowd will be arriving soon." "Lily," I began, searching desperately for words that refused to come. She offered a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to answer today." Then she walked toward the road without looking back, leaving me standing beneath the oak tree with a heart that suddenly felt far heavier than it had an hour earlier. The rest of the day passed in a blur of conversations I barely remembered. I signed invoices without reading them, repeated instructions I'd already given, and almost approved the wrong shipment for one of our largest restaurant clients. That evening, after the last employee drove away, I sat alone on the vineyard porch staring at Rebecca's empty rocking chair. My mind replayed Lily's words again and again, but instead of feeling hopeful, I felt guilty. Rebecca had been the love of my life. Loving anyone else felt dangerously close to betraying the promises we'd made to each other. And even if my heart had somehow begun changing without my permission, there was another truth I couldn't ignore. Lily deserved someone who could grow old beside her, not someone already watching the years disappear faster than he wanted to admit. Over the next several days, I tried convincing myself that the conversation beneath the old oak tree had been nothing more than an emotional misunderstanding, but my own memories refused to cooperate. The harder I tried to believe Lily had mistaken compassion for love, the more examples surfaced proving the opposite. I remembered the winter morning my truck slid into a ditch during a rainstorm and how she had closed the bakery without hesitation to drive 30 miles through flooded roads just to make sure I got home safely. I remembered finding homemade soup waiting on my porch every time harvest season kept me working too late to cook, though she always insisted one of her recipes had made far too much. She somehow knew exactly when I skipped lunch, when I hadn't slept well, or when a difficult business meeting had gone badly, often appearing with fresh coffee before I'd spoken a single word. None of those moments had felt unusual at the time because I had convinced myself they were simply acts of kindness from a thoughtful neighbor. Now they formed a pattern too obvious to ignore. Still, every hopeful thought was immediately buried beneath another voice inside my head reminding me that hope and responsibility weren't always the same thing. Late one afternoon I stopped by the local hardware store to pick up irrigation fittings before heading back to the vineyard. While comparing boxes of replacement valves, I overheard two customers chatting near the checkout counter. One of them laughed and mentioned seeing Lily having dinner the previous weekend with Ethan Collins, a 32-year-old landscape architect who had recently returned from Seattle after building a successful design company. Those two would make the perfect couple, one man said. Same age, both successful, both full of energy. About time she stopped spending all her free mornings at Daniel Mercer's vineyard. They chuckled before carrying their purchases outside, never realizing every word had landed like a stone in my chest. I had met Ethan once at a charity fundraiser. He was intelligent, confident, handsome, and exactly the kind of man any father would hope his daughter married. On the drive back to the vineyard, I couldn't stop comparing us. Ethan could give Lily decades of adventures, children if she wanted them, and a future untouched by the realities that came with loving a man 25 years older. I couldn't even promise I'd still be healthy 10 or 15 years from now. By the time I pulled into the winery parking lot, I'd almost convinced myself that letting her go wasn't an act of cowardice but an act of love. The following Friday arrived with cool autumn air and a sky streaked with soft gray clouds. As always, I found myself glancing toward the road long before 8 o'clock, pretending I wasn't waiting for someone. Right on time, Lily crossed the street carrying 2 coffees, though this time her smile seemed careful, almost guarded. We walked to the overlook without speaking much. Finally, gathering more courage than I felt, I broke the silence. I heard you've been spending time with Ethan Collins. She looked at me calmly. People around here notice everything. Is it true? He invited me to dinner. My stomach tightened, though I forced a polite smile. He's a good man. He is. Successful. Close to your age. She studied my face for several seconds before quietly asking, "Are you trying to convince me, or yourself?" I looked away toward the endless rows of vines glowing beneath the morning sun. Lily, someone like Ethan can give you the life you deserve. She folded her arms, disappointment replacing the softness in her eyes. Daniel, have you ever stopped to ask what kind of life I actually want? I didn't answer. She took a slow breath. You're making decisions for me because you're afraid to make one for yourself. Before I could defend myself, she added gently, Ethan asked if I'd go with him to the Valley Harvest Gala next Saturday. My heart sank. She looked directly into my eyes. I haven't answered him yet. Then, with one final sad smile, she turned toward the bakery, leaving me alone above the vineyard wondering if I was about to lose the woman I loved because I kept mistaking fear for sacrifice. I barely slept during the week leading up to the Valley Harvest Gala. Every evening I found myself sitting alone on the porch long after the vineyard had gone quiet, replaying every conversation Lily and I had shared over the past 3 years. The house felt larger than ever, each room filled with memories of Rebecca that no longer brought only comfort but also questions I had spent years avoiding. Had I really been honoring my late wife by refusing to let anyone else into my heart, or had I simply been hiding behind grief because it felt safer than risking love again? Saturday arrived with clear skies and the golden warmth of early autumn. The entire valley buzzed with excitement as wineries, restaurants, and local businesses prepared for the annual celebration. Guests arrived dressed in elegant evening clothes, strings of lights stretched between ancient oak trees, live music floated through the vineyards, and laughter echoed across the hills. I told myself I had no reason to attend. Large social gatherings had always been Rebecca's favorite, not mine. Instead, I stayed behind in my office pretending to organize invoices that didn't need organizing. Around 8 that evening I stepped outside and looked across the valley where thousands of tiny lights shimmered against the darkening sky. Without meaning to, I pictured Lily walking beside Ethan, smiling the way she smiled whenever she forgot the rest of the world existed. The image hurt far more than I wanted to admit because deep down I knew I had pushed her toward that future myself. Nearly an hour later, headlights swept across the vineyard entrance. A silver sedan pulled into the parking area, and before the engine even stopped, my heart somehow knew who it was. Lily stepped out wearing a deep emerald green dress beneath a light cream coat, her hair resting over her shoulders instead of being tied back as it usually was inside the bakery. For several seconds I simply stared, struck by how effortlessly beautiful she looked. She walked toward me slowly, uncertainty visible in every step. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said softly. "You never could," I replied without thinking. She glanced toward the glowing lights in the distance before looking back at me. "I left the gala early." My throat tightened. "Where's Ethan?" "He drove me back to the bakery." I walked the rest of the way. Silence settled between us, broken only by the distant music drifting across the valley. Finally, forcing myself to ask the question I dreaded all evening, I said, "Did he ask you to be with him?" She nodded once. My chest felt impossibly heavy. "And?" A gentle smile appeared, though sadness lingered behind it. "I told him no." Relief rushed through me so suddenly I had to look away. "Why?" I asked quietly. She gave a tiny laugh. "Daniel, how many times do I have to answer that?" I rubbed a hand across the back of my neck. "Because he could make you happy." "Maybe he could," she admitted. "But happiness isn't the same as love." I closed my eyes for a moment. Rebecca was the love of my life. Lily nodded without hesitation. "I know she was. Part of me feels that loving someone else means I'm leaving her behind." She stepped closer but stopped just short of reaching for my hand. "Loving me doesn't erase what you shared with Rebecca," she whispered. "It simply means your heart survived enough to love again." Her words stirred memories of Rebecca's final weeks in the hospital, especially something she'd whispered while holding my hand. "Promise me you won't spend the rest of your life surviving. Live, Daniel, even when I'm gone." At the time I thought she was talking about the vineyard. Standing in front of Lily, I finally realized she had been talking about my heart. Tears burned behind my eyes for the first time in years. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "Not because I don't care about you, but because I care far more than I ever intended." Lily's eyes filled with tears too, yet her smile remained gentle. "Then don't let fear make this decision for you." I reached toward her instinctively, but just before our hands touched, I hesitated. She noticed immediately. The hope in her expression faded into quiet understanding. "You're still not ready," she whispered. Then she stepped back. "And I can't keep waiting outside a door you're afraid to open." Without another word, she turned and walked into the darkness, leaving me standing alone beneath the vineyard lights, realizing that love doesn't always disappear all at once. Sometimes it simply walks away one slow step at a time. The following Friday arrived without the familiar sound of Lily's footsteps crossing the road. 8 o'clock came and went, yet the overlook remained empty except for the untouched bench where we'd shared so many quiet mornings. For the first time in years, the vineyard felt truly silent. I tried burying myself in work, but every task reminded me of her. The empty coffee mug beside my office window. The almond croissants I'd stopped buying because she'd always brought them first. Even the sunrise seemed dull without someone standing beside me to admire it. We exchanged only brief messages about bakery deliveries for wedding events hosted at the vineyard, and every conversation remained polite, distant, and painfully professional. 2 weeks later, while searching through old filing cabinets for insurance documents, I accidentally opened the bottom drawer of Rebecca's desk, something I hadn't touched since the month after her funeral. Beneath neatly organized folders rested a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in her familiar handwriting. My hands began trembling before I even unfolded the letter. "Daniel," it began, "if you're reading this, then life kept moving after mine stopped, exactly the way I prayed it would. Knowing you, you've probably convinced yourself that carrying my memory means closing your heart forever. But that isn't love. Love isn't a locked door. If one day someone walks into your life who makes you smile again, don't push her away because you think you're protecting me. You never belonged to my past, you belong to your future too. Please don't mistake guilt for loyalty. Live the life we dreamed you'd keep living, even if I can't be there beside you. By the time I reached the final sentence, tears blurred every word on the page. For 6 long years I'd believed preserving every untouched corner of the house honored Rebecca's memory. Instead, I'd built a museum around my grief and imprisoned myself inside it. That afternoon I carefully folded her favorite sweater and placed it inside a cedar chest instead of leaving it hanging behind the office door. I framed one of our happiest photographs and set it in the living room where it belonged, replacing dozens of painful reminders with a single beautiful memory. I wasn't saying goodbye to Rebecca. I was finally carrying her with me instead of allowing my sorrow to hold me still. The next morning, before fear had another chance to change my mind, I walked across the country road toward Lily's bakery. Through the front window I saw her arranging fresh bread behind the display counter while soft jazz played in the background. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up in surprise. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I took a slow breath. "I've spent years pretending I was protecting you," I said. "The truth is, I was protecting myself from ever losing someone again." Her eyes never left mine. "I'm still afraid," I admitted. "I'm afraid people will judge us. I'm afraid I won't have enough years with you. I'm afraid one day you'll look at me and wish you'd chosen someone younger. But I'm far more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to love the woman already standing in front of me." Tears slipped quietly down Lily's cheeks. I stepped closer and gently took both of her hands. This time I didn't pull away. "If you still mean what you said beneath that oak tree," I whispered, "I'd like to stop hiding behind fear and start building whatever future we have, together." She laughed through her tears, the same warm laugh that had brightened countless Friday mornings. "Daniel," she said softly, squeezing my hands, "I never needed the most years with you. I only wanted the years we were given." Then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against mine as morning sunlight poured through the bakery windows, and for the first time since Rebecca's passing, I understood that healing doesn't ask us to forget the people we've loved. It simply gives our hearts permission to love again.